Whether they are of higher racial value is something else, but historical and sociological data does support the notion that wealthier and more highly educated individuals often have fewer children due to career priorities and access to birth control. Okay, that's why he abandons birth control as an option, but what about emigration? He writes the following.
As a matter of fact, the New Reich never knew how to banish this need for food. Even in the New Reich at first, an attempt was made to keep the relation between population and land within tolerable limits through a permanent emigration. For the most shattering proof of the soundness of our assertion of the towering importance of the relation between population and land lies in the fact that, in consequence of this disproportion, specifically in Germany during the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, the distress led to an epidemic of emigration which even at the beginning of the 1890s had swollen to a figure of nearly 1.25 million people a year.
Now, one might ask Hitler, what is wrong with the German population emigrating out of Germany into other countries? By moving Germans onto other lands where there is more food and resources, it would seem that emigration might actually be something that would allow the German population to keep growing. Is it not so? Here is why Hitler writes as an answer to that.
Since the German folk does not consist of Jews, the German element, especially in Anglo-Saxon countries, nevertheless and unfortunately will increasingly be anglicized and presumably likewise be lost to our folk, spiritually and ideologically as well, just as its practical work accomplishments are already lost to them.
He means that the Jews, compared to other peoples, such as the Germans, have a stronger national identity, and that's why the Jews can manage to live inside other nations without getting absorbed and losing and forgetting their original identity. He means that this would not work for Germans. He also means that those Germans emigrating to other countries will not be Germans for long. That they would be given as a free gift to the host nation and blend in with the passage of time. If we today, 2024, exactly 100 years later, look at the German element in the United States, this is actually what largely has happened.
Of the Germans not united with the motherland, in consequence of the slow loss of dedicated racial comrades, millions of Germans find themselves in a situation which, in all human probability, will one day cause their de-Germanization. In no case, however, will they be able to take further part in the motherland's fateful struggle in any kind of decisive form, and just as little, too, in the cultural development of their folk. Whatever the German element individually accomplishes in North America, it will not be reckoned to the benefit of the German folk as such, but adds to the cultural aggregate of the American Union. Here the Germans are really only the cultural fertilizers for other folks. Indeed, in reality, the greatness of these nations is in general not seldom to be ascribed to the high percentage of German contributions and accomplishments. It is sad to know that our whole national political wisdom, insofar as it does not see any advantage at all in emigration, is at most saddened by the weakening of the number of its own people, or at best speaks of a cultural fertilizer which is thereby given to other states.
As a side note to this first point, Hitler also means that the loss of Germans abroad can be reduced and mitigated if Germany in the motherland transmits a good impression abroad. Which goes back to my earlier point. The Germans in the United States have, as a result of Germany losing World War II and the subsequent shame, etc., distanced themselves even more from their German nationality.
If, notwithstanding, the German element abroad wants to remain true to the nation, this can at the outset be only a question of a language and cultural loyalty, in that the more it rises to a consciously manifested feeling of belongingness, the more does the motherland of the German nation honor the German name in the dignity of her representatives. Thus, the more Germany as a Reich transmits a mark of the greatness of the German folk to the world, the more will the German element, conclusively lost to the state, receive a stimulus, at least to take pride in belonging spiritually to this folk. On the other hand, the more wretchedly the motherland herself attends to her interests and accordingly transmits a bad impression abroad, the weaker will the inner inducement be felt to belong to such a folk.
Secondly, Hitler's perhaps greatest anger about emigration stems from his reasoning that emigration steals the strongest and best people from Germany and that by doing so, it's making the German people weaker and weaker.
Through emigration, a folk is slowly robbed of its best blood in hundreds of thousands of individual life catastrophes. What is not perceived is the worst. Since the emigration does not proceed according to territory, nor according to age categories, but instead remains subject to the free rule of fate, it always drains away from a folk the most courageous and the boldest people, the most determined and most prepared for resistance. The peasant youth who emigrated to America 150 years ago was as much the most determined and most adventurous man in his village as the worker who today goes to Argentina. The coward and weakling would rather die at home than pluck up the courage to earn his bread in an unknown foreign land. Regardless whether it is distress, misery, political pressure, or religious compulsion that weighs on people, it will always be those who are the healthiest and the most capable of resistance who will be able to put up the most resistance. The weakling will always be the first to subject himself. His preservation is generally as little a gain for the victor as the stay-at-homes are for the mother country. Not seldom, therefore, the law of action is passed on from the mother country to the colonies, because there a concentration of the highest human values has taken place in a wholly natural way. However, the positive gain for the new country is thus a loss for the mother country. As soon as a folk once loses its best, strongest, and most natural forces through emigration in the course of centuries, it will hardly be able any more to muster the inner strength to put up the necessary resistance to fate in critical times. Human birth control wipes out the bearer of the highest values, and emigration destroys the value of the average.
So there you have it, a summary as complete as possible of why and how Hitler thought that the lack of living space in Germany was a problem, and also the end of this first part of the two-part video series. Now you know what the problem for Germany was after World War I, and why increasing the productivity of the soil, that is internal colonization, birth control or emigration, were not seen by Hitler as realistic solutions. As I explained in the introduction, the second part will deal with what Hitler thought the solution should be to the lack of living space. That is, the might of a victorious sword and the sword as the pathbreaker for the plow.
The might of a victorious sword, and the sword as the pathbreaker for the plow.